Prince Edward Island is where Canada sends you when it wants to show you what the country could have looked like without the Industrial Revolution. The island's dominant cultural export for over a century has been the story of an optimistic, red-haired orphan who made Cavendish feel like the safest, most cheerful corner of the world. Well, that is one version of Prince Edward Island. The island itself has another version, and it is older. Before the pastoral farmland, there were forests. Before the farms, there were the Mi'kmaq people, who called the island Epekweek, meaning cradled on the waves, and who accumulated centuries of folklore about the beings that shared it with them, the spirits that lingered in its coves, and the energies that did not leave when the people who carried them died. Onto that substrate came wars, expulsions, shipwrecks, economic collapses, and a long roster of buildings and communities that simply ran out of reasons to exist and were left standing in the red clay as the province kept going around them. Here are 17 of the places where that other version of Prince Edward Island is still visible, audible, and in some cases, actively present. Number 17. The Battle of Pretty Stream, a Vanished People. Long before European maps existed for this island, Mi'kmaq oral tradition described the island as shared territory. Not with other human groups, but with smaller beings the tradition called the Tweedlers. The accounts describe small, magical entities living in hidden settlements in the forests and coves of the island, possessing capabilities that place them somewhere between the human and the supernatural in the cosmological understanding of the people who passed the stories down. The oral tradition holds that when the Mi'kmaq arrived in force, a conflict broke out between the two groups at a place known as Pretty Stream. The account describes 3 days of brutal struggle, ending with the Mi'kmaq prevailing and the Tweedlers disappearing. The stream, the tradition says, ran red. The beings themselves are described as having vanished rather than simply being defeated, a distinction the oral tradition preserves carefully. Whether that vanishing means extinction, migration to somewhere invisible, or a retreat into a dimension of the island that subsequent inhabitants could not access, is left open. Reports of small, figure-like sightings in the deeper forested areas of PPE I have accumulated across multiple generations and multiple communities. The island's folklore tradition does not treat the Tweedlers as entirely past. It treats them as presences whose relationship to the current moment is simply not visible in the same way that other presences are. That is a different thing from gone. Number 16. The Minayata Stone, a healing rock that chose its healers. One of the most complete mythological narratives attached to Prince Edward Island concerns a Mi'kmaq girl named Minayata, a lake said to be inhabited by a great water spirit, and the consequences of a French woman breaking the sacred rules surrounding a healing stone that the legend says appeared after Minayata sacrificed herself to prevent the lake from flooding the entire island. The stone, according to the tradition, had genuine healing properties, but only for those of Mi'kmaq blood. The boundary was not arbitrary. It was structural. The healing power came from a specific relationship between the stone, the sacrifice that created it, and the people on whose behalf the sacrifice was made. When a French woman used the stone to save her dying daughter, the stone crumbled. The curse that followed, the tradition holds, persisted through the woman's family line for generations. What makes this legend worth including in a list of this kind is not whether the stone existed or whether the healing was real. It is the specific cultural information encoded in the narrative that certain places and objects carry relational conditions, that those conditions are not superstition but governance, and that violating them has consequences that the violation itself cannot undo. The lake the legend refers to sits somewhere in the interior of PPEI. The stone is gone, the tradition of the story is not. Number 15. The Kirk of St. James Bell, forerunners of the Fairy Queen disaster. Prince Edward Island has a documented tradition of what island culture calls forerunners, unexplained events that precede disaster by hours or days in ways that the people who experience them interpret as warnings from forces beyond ordinary perception. The tradition is specific enough that particular types of forerunners have been catalogued. 3 loud knocks on a door with no one present, pictures falling at the moment a distant relative dies, a voice calling a name from a location with no speaker visible. The most specifically documented forerunner event in PEI history occurred in 1853 at the Kirk of St. James Church in Charlottetown. Early one morning, a ship's bell began ringing violently from the harbor. No vessel was in the harbor. 3 figures in white were seen at the church, one at the bell. By that afternoon, the steamer Fairy Queen had sunk in the Northumberland Strait, drowning 7 people, including 3 passengers connected to that church. The relationship between the morning bell and the afternoon sinking is not explainable through the ordinary logic of cause and effect, and that is precisely what the forerunner tradition preserves, not an explanation, but a record. The Kirk of St. James still stands in Charlottetown. The bell has not rung unattended since. Number 14. The Phantom Ship of Northumberland Strait. Sightings of a 3-masted schooner fully engulfed in flames, sailing the Northumberland Strait in apparent silence before vanishing or sinking, have been recorded since 1786. The sightings are not marginal or anecdotal in their documentation. They extend across 2 centuries, cover the full coastal communities of PPEI and Nova Scotia facing the strait, and include enough specific detail across independent accounts that the phenomenon was considered substantial enough to feature on a Canada Post stamp in 2014. The ship appears most frequently between September and November, before northeast winds. Reports consistently describe a schooner with 3 or 4 masts with white sails that are on fire from bottom to top, sailing at speed with no visible crew response to the flames. Numerous attempts to approach the ship by boat across the reported sightings have ended the same way. The vessel disappears before contact can be made. A 1900 account from the Charlottetown harbor describes a group of sailors taking a rowboat toward the burning vessel before it vanished. A 1965 sighting from Cape John was reportedly witnessed by hundreds of people on both the Nova Scotia and PEI coasts simultaneously. Scientific proposals have been offered involving atmospheric light refraction and the appearance of celestial objects on the horizon. The consistency of the description across accounts spanning 200 years does not map cleanly onto any of them. Number 13. De Blois, Confederation Trail. The Phantom Train. The Confederation Trail is the most popular recreational trail in Prince Edward Island. 449 kilometers of stone dust path running tip to tip across the island on the converted bed of a railway line that was decommissioned over the second half of the 20th century. Most people who walk or cycle it in summer are thinking about the scenery and the distance to the next food stop, not about the history of what they are standing on. Near Tiniche, at the western end of the island, the Confederation Trail passes through the former station area of De Blois. The rail line in this section was the site of a serious accident in 1932, a bad crash during a snowstorm that has left its mark on the area's reputation in a specific way. The accounts that have accumulated around this section of the former rail line are consistent. a phantom train whistle heard along the route, and a ball of light seen traveling at speed along the path where the tracks used to run. The interpretation offered in the folklore of the area is that the light is either a ghostly replay of the event itself or the spirit of the engineer still running the route that the accident interrupted. The trail above the old bed is quiet, well used, and photographed by tourists most of the year. It is a different experience after dark in that section, by the accounts of the people who have had it. Number 12. Woodley Replicas, Burlington, The Abandoned Castles. In 1945, a veteran of both World Wars began building scale replicas of British architectural landmarks on a 30-acre property outside Kensington. The project took decades. By the time Woodley Replicas opened as a tourist attraction in 1957, the grounds contained reproductions of St. Paul's Cathedral, the Tower of London, with working replicas of the crown jewels in the armories, Anne Hathaway's cottage, Shakespeare's birthplace, and Dunvegan Castle, all built by hand at varying scales in the landscape of rural PEI. For several decades in the mid-20th century, Woodley was the most successful tourist attraction on the island. Then the scale of the world changed. Attendance declined. The health of the final owner deteriorated. In 2008, Woodley Replicas closed for the last time. The government of PEI held the mortgage and tried to find a buyer. The castle sat. For years, the property existed in a peculiar state. Enormous architectural replicas standing in a weedy PEI field, visible from the road, slowly deteriorating. Local reports from residents who explored the grounds during the closure years described the atmosphere of the property as something between a film set and a dream. Scale replicas of medieval fortresses in a maritime Canadian pastoral landscape produce a specific cognitive dissonance that the photographs from that period capture well. In 2021, the property was purchased and restoration began on Dunvegan Castle and the Tower of London for private events use. The castles are being brought back. Whether they are still haunted is a question the new owners are living with. Number 11. Fairyland, Kensington, The Arch, Nobody Looks Up, just outside Kensington on the Trans-Canada Highway, visible from the road to anyone who knows to look right when heading west, is an archway. The arch is all that remains of Fairyland, one of a collection of roadside attractions that defined PEI tourism in the mid-20th century, when the car was ascendant and opening a whimsical attraction on a well-traveled route was enough of a business model to keep it running for years. Fairyland operated as a themed garden and children's attraction in the post-war era, one of several island properties that catered to the specific imagination of the period, a time when miniature castles, theme parks, and fairy tale landscapes were genuinely competitive with the beaches and the scenery as reasons to stop. As tourism patterns changed and families began expecting more than a pleasant walk through an imaginative landscape, Fairyland's attendance faded. The property was eventually absorbed into its surroundings. The highway widened. The structures came down. What remains is the arch, built in the period style of roadside fantasy architecture, standing at the edge of a property that has returned to ordinary rural use. Local discussions about it describe pulling over from the highway and walking up to look at it, which is still possible. Most people who drive past it have no idea it is there. The few who know what it was describe the experience of standing at the arch as something slightly out of phase with the modern landscape around it, the feeling of a threshold to something that used to be on the other side. Number 10. Holland Cove, The Ghost on the Ice. Holland Cove on the northern coast of PEI carries a ghost story that is specific enough in its detail to have persisted across the generations of the communities that border it. In 1764, a Dutch surveyor arrived on the island to map it for the British colonial administration. His wife came with him. On a winter day, while the surveyor was away at work, his wife went out onto the ice of Holland Cove and fell through. The ice gave way and she drowned. The ghost story that followed from this event has not faded in the way that most colonial-era tragedy stories fade. It has instead remained specific to the location, tied to the cove by name, tied to the seasonal conditions that produced the original tragedy. Reports from the communities around Holland Cove describe an apparition, consistently characterized as a tall woman in white, seen moving along the water when the tide is high. Those who have reported hearing a voice call a name from the water in that area have described the same experience regardless of their familiarity with the story beforehand. Holland Cove is one of the 5 locations that PEI's local paranormal research community ranks among the island's most reliably active sites. It appears on no tourist map. It is simply a cove on the northern coast that has been carrying the same story for nearly 260 years and shows no sign of letting it go. Number 9, Bay Fortune, Captain Kidd's buried treasure. The eastern coast of PEI is quiet country. Small fishing, communities, farmland running down to red clay cliffs, the occasional heritage building visible from the road. Bay Fortune is in this landscape, and it holds a claim to something that is either genuine, buried pirate treasure or one of the most persistent pieces of regional folklore on the island, depending on which you consider more plausible. The legend holds that treasure buried at Bay Fortune belongs to one of the most notorious pirates in Atlantic history, a Scottish-born privateer who operated in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean in the late 17th century before his capture and execution in London in 1701. The Fortune area's association with dark history extends beyond the treasure legend. The woods around the bay have a reputation for unexplained activity. The coffin of a famous 19th century actor, an Irishman who moved to Bay Fortune late in his life and died there in 1899, reportedly floated from a shipwreck en route to a New York burial and washed ashore at Bay Fortune. The fact that the coffin returned to the place where the man had lived was interpreted by those who witnessed it as something more than accident. Cape Able, just east of the Fortune area, is named after a murder committed there in 1819. The concentration of violent history, ghost legend, and buried treasure stories in this single stretch of eastern PEI coastline is not matched anywhere else on the island. Number 8. The Confederation Bridge Fabrication Yard. Borden. Borden, Carlton, at the western tip of PEI, is where the Confederation Bridge touches the island. The 12.9-kilometer fixed-link crossing that connected PEI to the mainland in 1997 and fundamentally changed the island's relationship to the rest of Canada in ways that are still being debated. The bridge required the largest marine construction project in Canadian history, and the fabrication yard, where its massive concrete spans were cast and assembled, sat on the Borden shore, an industrial operation at a scale the island had never previously hosted. When construction finished, the fabrication yard was decommissioned. What was left behind occupies a stretch of the Borden waterfront that does not feature in the tourism literature, large industrial infrastructure that has been sitting in various states of disuse since the bridge was completed. Local accounts describe exploring the site and encountering an industrial landscape that does not map onto the surrounding pastoral character of the western tip of PEI. The The structures are the right age to have developed the kind of atmospheric density that abandoned industrial sites accumulate, and their scale, designed for an operation that assembled the largest construction project in the country, is disproportionate to the small town landscape around them. Nobody is building another bridge from this yard. The question of what eventually happens to the site sits in the category of things PEI discusses periodically and has not yet resolved. Number 7. West Point Lighthouse Inn, Lighthouse Willie. West Point Lighthouse is the only lighthouse on Prince Edward Island that people can sleep inside. The lighthouse itself was constructed in 1875, and its tower is the tallest wooden lighthouse in Canada. In 1987, a community volunteer organization converted the keeper's quarters into a functioning inn, preserving the structure while creating a tourism asset for the rural western tip of the island. What the conversion also preserved, according to the accounts of community members, staff, and guests who have spent time in the building, is the presence of the lighthouse's first keeper. The figure, referred to locally as Lighthouse Willie, has been reported primarily in the keeper's quarters portion of the building, particularly in the room directly adjacent to the tower stairs. A community member involved in the early restoration described a night in the late 1980s when she had turned off all the power in the building, returned for forgotten documents using a flashlight, and found the kitchen lights on upon re-entry, no more than 10 minutes after she had confirmed everything was dark. Reports of a bearded man visible in the second-floor room, particularly near the window facing the water, have come from multiple people across multiple years who did not know the existing stories at the time of their experience. The lighthouse still operates as an inn. The ghost hunt events hosted there annually sell out. Number 6. Yo House, Port Hill, the haunted toy. The Yo House in Port Hill is a Victorian mansion built by the son of one of 19th century PEI's most powerful shipbuilding dynasties. In the 1800s, the shipbuilders of Prince Edward Island were the financial elite of the province. The island was the third largest shipbuilding jurisdiction in the British Empire at its peak, and the Yo family's holdings reflected that. The house is now a museum operated as part of the Green Park Shipbuilding Museum Complex. What the house is most recently known for within the island's paranormal community is an object called Wheelie, a small antique toy dog discovered within the walls of the house during restoration work. The toy was found sealed in a wall cavity with no explanation for how it got there or how long it had been there. After it was brought out and placed on display, staff began reporting that Wheelie's position would change between their visits. The toy would be found in different orientations or different locations within its display area than where it had been left. Multiple staff members at the site have acknowledged experiencing unexplained phenomena in the house, and the Green Park paranormal community has identified Yo House as one of the most active locations on the island. The house itself is full of cold spots and has a reputation for female voices heard in the upper rooms when no one is upstairs. Number 5. The King's Playhouse, Georgetown. Captain George's Seat. The King's Playhouse in Georgetown is one of the oldest community theaters in Canada, and it maintains a specific protocol that most theater venues do not. Before every performance, a front row seat is reserved. It is not reserved for a patron. It is reserved for a ghost the staff and community refer to as Captain George, who died in 1918, and who, by the accounts of the community and the paranormal investigators who have spent nights in the building, has not finished with the place. Reports from the King's Playhouse are specific and varied in type. members of the audience grabbed by a hand during performances, lighting and technical systems failing at moments not attributable to equipment malfunction, shadows moving in photographs taken inside the building, footsteps and voices documented by multiple visitors who were not aware of each other's experiences. A television crew that spent 2 days and nights in the building for a documentary about haunted maritime locations reported visual movement in the theater area involving heavy objects that were not near air currents, and unexplained footsteps in the rear area of the building that could not be attributed to any source. The director of photography described being relieved to leave. The King's Playhouse continues to operate. Captain George continues to have his seat. Number 4. Fort Amherst, the Vanishing Church. Fort Amherst sits at the entrance to Charlottetown Harbor on the southern coast of PEY, and its history contains one of the most consequential events in Atlantic Canadian colonial history. In 1758, the British forcibly deported more than 3,000 Acadian inhabitants of the island, then known as Île Saint-Jean, as part of a strategy to dismantle the French colony during the 7 Years' War. The deportation was among the largest and deadliest of the Acadian expulsions. Over half of the deported population died from shipwreck or disease during transport. Around 1,100 people evaded deportation by fleeing into the interior. The legend attached to Fort Amherst describes a church that existed on the grounds where the Acadian community gathered on the night before their forced departure. The congregation had begun their prayers, Latin hymns that carried through the building, when soldiers ordered them to stop and move toward the waiting ships. Their prayers were cut short. The church, abandoned to the expulsion's aftermath, eventually vanished from the physical landscape. What the legend holds is that on certain nights the church reappears. Witnesses describe candlelight visible through what appear to be windows in a structure that is not there, and the sound of voices reciting the phrase "Ora pro nobis," pray for us. The earthworks of Fort Amherst are a National Historic Site. The ghost of what was done there in 1758 is not interpreted on any plaque. Number 3. The abandoned Bell River Mansion, a house with no explanation. At the end of Stewart Point Road in Bell River on the eastern shore of PPEI, accessible via a dirt road that leads to a beach, sits a large abandoned mansion. Its windows are broken. Its interior has been disturbed by years of uninvited visitors who have carried off furniture and left behind the structural damage that buildings accumulate when no one is maintaining them. Hornets have established territories in the upper rooms. The house belonged to owners who came from outside the island and who, according to the community accounts that have passed through conversations about the property for years, passed away without leaving arrangements for what would happen to it. The estate was not settled. The building was not sold. It simply sat at the end of the dirt road, becoming less of what it was, year by year, while the beach at the end of the road continued to draw visitors who discovered the house as an afterthought. What makes the Bell River Mansion different from other abandoned properties on this list is the absence of a narrative around it. Most abandoned buildings on PEI carry a story, an expulsion, a mine closure, a failed attraction, a family tragedy. This house carries nothing verifiable. It exists without explanation at the end of a road in eastern PPEI, deteriorating on a timeline that nothing has interrupted, generating the specific unease that comes from a mystery with no identified starting point. Number 2. The Haunted Wood, Anne's Island before Anne. Cavendish is where Lucy Maud Montgomery grew up and where the landscape that became the setting for Anne of Green Gables exists in the physical world. the farmland, the shore, the woodlands, the red roads. The place tourism has been selling for over a century is real, and it is genuinely beautiful in the way the books describe. What the books also describe, in a way that gets less attention than the farmhouse and the school, is a forest. The spruce grove near the fictional Green Gables property is described as a haunted wood, where a wailing white lady appears before a death in the family, where the trees close in differently after dark, and where the boundary between the ordinary world and something else becomes permeable in ways that the girl who lived there understood as stories, but the landscape understood as geography. Montgomery was drawing on the actual folklore of the actual place. The ghost stories she gave her character were the ghost stories of the community she grew up in. The headless men on the paths, the icy fingers placed on the hands of solitary walkers near Idlewild, the presences in the dark groves that the settled community learned to acknowledge without explaining. Cavendish draws millions of tourists to see the pastoral surface of the island. The forest at dusk in Cavendish is where what was there before the pastoral surface is still operating on its own terms. And at number 1 is Beaconsfield Historic House, a Victorian mansion's hidden inheritance. Beaconsfield. Historic house on Kent Street in Charlottetown was designed in 1877 as one of the most elegant private residences in the province, a Victorian mansion with all the materials, craftsmanship, and modern conveniences that the period's elite could access. It was built for a merchant family that moved into it and discovered that elegance and stability are different things. The original owners were forced to sell within a few years of moving in. Their finances collapsed by circumstances that the Victorian era produced with specific efficiency for those who reached beyond their means. The second family moved in and lived there until the early 20th century, when the building transitioned to institutional use, a residence for young women, then a home for student nurses, then eventually a museum. The house is haunted by the accounts of the community in the way that buildings haunted by too many layers of other people's significant experiences tend to be haunted, not by one dramatic presence, but by an accumulation. The ghost tour community in Charlottetown treats Beaconsfield as one of the primary stops in the city's documented haunted landscape. The specific reports include a veiled woman, a painting with an occupant that seems to track movement, and the kind of cold spot geography that the Victorian house's architecture, which is exceptionally well preserved, amplifies rather than dampens. What makes Beaconsfield the most significant entry on this list is the combination of documented history, physical preservation, and active institutional presence that makes it accessible and closed simultaneously. You can tour it, you can see the rooms and the architecture and the heritage collection. What you cannot do is stay long enough after the tours close and the staff leave to find out what the building does when it has the night to itself. That information belongs to the building. Before we close, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It's the most direct way to support the channel. Drop a comment about which of these 17 you'd most want to visit, or which you've already been to. Local knowledge in the comments on these videos consistently adds more than the research does. Prince Edward Island sells red roads and green fields, and a fictional red-haired orphan who made contentment look achievable. The island underneath that tourism layer is a place that has been inhabited for 10,000 years, expulsed, settled, resettled, built over, abandoned, and reimagined so many times that the layers of what happened here have never fully separated from the landscape. Every abandoned arch, every haunted lighthouse, every theater with a reserved front row seat, every church that appears on certain nights to say the prayers it was interrupted from finishing. They are all the same island. One version is on the tourism website. The other is still out there in the dark by the water, waiting to be noticed.